The neonatal nurse, Lucy Letby, has been found guilty.
The nature of these crimes is difficult to comprehend.
A nurse allegedly left a handwritten note.
I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough to care for them.
Killing babies is the worst thing you could be accused of.
On the 18th of August, 2023, 33-year-old nurse Lucy Letby was found guilty at Manchester Crown Court of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 6 more at the Countess of Chester Hospital.
Lucy Letby now bears the title of one of the UK's most prolific child serial killers of modern times.
This was one of the most despicable, horrific crimes in our history.
It's talked about on Newsnight, it's talked about in the House of Commons. It's on the front page of every major newspaper. She's a child murderer.
Given 15 whole life sentences, she will die in prison. But now, questions and concerns about the case against Lucy Letby have begun to emerge.
If there is evidence of guilt, then it's not been presented to the courts as far as I'm concerned.
Headlines in British and international press tell of a growing number of doctors, journalists, politicians, pathologists, and statisticians who are raising questions about the case against her.
I can't say whether Lucy Letby is innocent or guilty. What I can say is I don't think the science and statistics were presented fairly to the trial.
And people have started to now ask a question that would once have been inconceivable. Following Lucy Letby's conviction, Dr. Phil Hammond was convinced of her guilt. He wrote a piece in his column for Private Eye magazine asking why Letby wasn't brought to justice sooner. But now, he has doubts about the case against her.
I was an NHS doctor for 35 years, and I've been Private Eye's medical correspondent for 32 years. And one of the things I specialise in supporting NHS whistleblowers. So when the Lucy Letby story broke, originally, the verdict came out. Because 7 consultant paediatricians who'd worked at the Countess of Chester Hospital had thought she was guilty, and 6 expert witnesses supported that, I thought, gosh, this is pretty conclusive. My original article in Private Eye that went out in August was to trust the whistleblowers and argue the index of suspicion should have been high enough, and either the hospital or the doctors themselves should have gone to the police earlier. As soon as the article went out, I got a whole host of experts of equivalent status coming to me and saying, hang on, I don't think this is proven beyond reasonable doubt. So I contacted a wide number of experts, from statisticians to neonatologists. The great thing about Private Eye is that it's absolutely fine to change your mind. When you have so many experts from so many different walks of life, all raising legitimate concerns, it makes you think these are reasonable people with reasonable doubts. So how did the jury find her guilty beyond reasonable doubt? And that's the biggest question to me that hasn't been answered.
So how did Lucy Letby come to be accused in the first place? Between June 2015 and June 2016, the Countess of Chester neonatal unit experienced an unusual cluster of deaths of babies in their care. And no one knew why, until an association was spotted by doctors that Lucy Letby was on shift when these deaths occurred.
What we see here is a spreadsheet that was presented to the court as a key piece of evidence. It's a chart showing across the top all the different nurses who worked on the ward, and down the side you have 25 suspicious events. And what we see is that there's a pattern of X's throughout the column with Lucy Letby's name on it.
The Rota spreadsheet covers 13 months between June 2015 and June 2016 and shows Letby at the scene of 25 suspicious events. She is the one common denominator.
I'm Peter Green, Emeritus Professor of Statistics here in Bristol, and I've a long career studying various aspects of statistics. This rota appears extremely damning because it's a very simple story to tell. And the eye is naturally drawn to what seems to be an extremely strong coincidence. She's always there when these events happen. There was enough in the papers in that time to understand that there had been a pattern of excess deaths in a particular ward in this hospital in Chester, and that there was a suspicion fallen on this particular nurse.
But the Lucy Letby case isn't unique. In 2003, Lucia de Burke, a Dutch paediatric nurse, was convicted in the Netherlands of multiple murders and attempted murders. Like Lucy Letby, Lucia de Burke was accused of being responsible for a cluster of unexpected deaths, and the police were called in. But she was later acquitted when statisticians questioned the data evidence used against her.
My name is Richard Gill. I'm a retired professor of mathematical statistics. The case of Lucia de Burke is thought by many people to have been the biggest miscarriage of justice in the Netherlands. It was the Lucy Letby case. The cases have everything in common. A nurse who is a bit different from other nurses. There are bad things happening in the hospital and the nurse gets to blame. Thinking, which starts with the idea that we have a serial killer and we already know who she is and we've got to prove it. So the tunnel vision is the same. You have people dying in a place where people die. And it makes the scenario already completely different from the usual murder investigation. In the usual murder investigation, you start with some murders and look for who did them. And it's very, very dangerous to start with a preconceived idea that somebody did it. My job was to explain to ordinary people that the statistics did not say that she was guilty.
After almost 7 years in prison, Lucia de Burke was exonerated and released.
Finally, they had to admit that I was innocent, that the people, the children, all died natural causes.
You were released from prison. The Attorney General of the Netherlands called you to his office to personally apologize.
Yeah.
Will you go back to nursing?
No, never. No. Mm-mm. I'd always be afraid something happened.
But that was your profession. That was what you loved to do.
They took that from me too.
When Lucia was exonerated, well, I was in the court. It was one of the most beautiful days of my life. Everything about the Lucy Letby case made me feel sick. It was the same story again. And terrible that nobody in England seemed to have ever heard of Lucia de Burke.
This is the report that we produced for the Royal Statistical Society. Healthcare serial killer or coincidence, statistical issues in the investigation of suspected medical misconduct. This concerns trials of medical professionals who are accused partly on the basis of data collected, which maps their duty rosters against the times of the adverse events. And so the assumption is that their presence on the ward is probable cause of the death. What we sought to write down here was guidelines for the analysis and interpretation of data of this kind. Now, my concerns about these data are, what was the selection of an event as being suspicious? Were all these nurses actually on ward duty? Why are the doctors not visible in this chart? So all of those things seem to us to be potentially sources of bias. But the main thing is there's no other information about all these suspicious events or other information about the infants concerned.
And now, questions have emerged about the other deaths which occurred in the unit during this time period.
Lucy Letby was charged with 7 murders, and the jury only heard about those. What we should all know is that there were many other deaths in that ward. Estimates vary of how many more, but at least 6 other deaths during the period covered by this duty roster. And evidence about those were not presented in the court. Why did they happen? When we're teaching statistics, we show our students good and bad practice. And this spreadsheet, as presented in the courtroom, is a lovely example of how not to do something.
But was Lucy Letby a danger to these babies? Or was the ward itself the danger?
It simply didn't have enough experienced doctors and nurses on duty to provide safe care for the complexity of babies that it had to look after.
In January 2012, Lucy Letby started working in the neonatal unit of the Countess of Chester Hospital, just before her 22nd birthday.
In terms of Lucy Letby's character, prior to the allegations being made, from what I've read, it seems that she was quite an outgoing person. I'm Dr. Faye Skelton, and I'm a lecturer in psychology at Edinburgh Napier University. My main interests are cognition, whether we can detect deception with any sort of reliability, particularly applied to the justice system. Accounts from Lucy Letby's colleagues suggest that she was reliable, very conscientious. She seemed to be quite a happy, optimistic person that was very happy in her job.
Letby's life mostly revolved around her work in the neonatal unit, the specialist ward where sick, premature and newborn babies are cared for. In 2013, she was chosen by the hospital for a staff profile in the local paper. The photograph used became one of the most recognizable images of Lucy Letby in the media. In spring 2015, she became more qualified. She was now a specialist neonatal nurse, dealing with the most critically ill babies.
She was one of the few nurses trusted to look after the most vulnerable infants, and she was one of the most highly qualified nurses on the unit.
She was often at the bedside of the most complex babies. She volunteered for extra shifts, which she did because she was saving for a house.
From June 2015 to June 2016, the neonatal unit experienced an unusual spike in the number of infant deaths, more than double the yearly average. This 13-month period would go on to define the criminal investigation and subsequent trial.
If you see a spike of deaths, you need to try and investigate to understand why. Often what happens when a unit has a spike is they ask for an independent view. And the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health came in and found they didn't have enough consultants. And sometimes the junior doctors were reluctant to call for help.
The Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health report found problems with staffing, competencies, leadership, team working, and culture.
These are extremely ill infants in a hospital with multiple problems. Organizational, physical problems, environmental problems. Runs of adverse outcomes often occur in such situations.
There were facilities problems in the Countess of Chester neonatal unit. It was an old unit, built in 1972. There'd been campaigns to upgrade it. It didn't have enough space. The unit was quite cramped.
An additional problem with the unit was also highlighted in court when a hospital plumber was called to give evidence that sanitation was an issue. He gave testimony on the frequent drainage problems, which included foul water backing up in wash-hand basins in the intensive care suite.
It's not unusual in hospital wards to get outbreaks of infection. One of the ways of reducing the risk of infection is to have adequate space between incubators. There was a cross-infection risk, but probably most importantly, it simply didn't have enough experienced doctors and nurses on duty to provide safe care for the complexity of babies that it had to look after. Consultants on that very unit had written to their managers and senior managers and chief executive to say, we just don't have enough staff.
Some experts are now asking, were these murders Or could there be another explanation? At the same time, there was a rise in the infant mortality rate across England and Wales, and 2 out of 3 neonatal units were short-staffed.
Neonatal deaths went up in 2015, the very year there was this influx across the country. Our maternity units and our neonatal units across the UK are under extreme pressure.
The NHS is not what it used to be when I started working within it. We are enormously challenged and suboptimal outcomes occur. My name is Dr. Svelena Dimitrova. I'm a consultant neonatologist, and I'm very happy to put my name and title to everything I have to say. However, I have requested for my face to be blurred because I don't want to be recognized on the street by strangers, and I'm worried about potential repercussions due to the sensitivity surrounding this case. I've worked in more than 15 hospitals in my career, and I've worked on 5 surgical neonatal units, and these issues are endemic. We can see issues that have not come to light with regards to the circumstances at the Countess of Chester that we suspect have played a very big role in the increased incidence of deaths in those years. What it has definitely led to is huge fear amidst especially the neonatal nursing body. I have never seen so many nurses resign as I have seen in the past 18 months.
An experienced neonatal nurse at a UK hospital wanted to speak up, on condition she remains anonymous.
I'm a neonatal nurse. I work in a level 2 unit and I have done for at least 10 years. I do love my job, but since this case, it's made me and others quite worried. I think there's a general fear speaking up. The case has had a negative effect on our profession. It's made us more worried about what the parents might think. I think it's alarming how they've thrown allegations at Lucy. I realise how easily it could have been one of my colleagues. Me. What's gone on with Lucy is very close to home.
From October 2015, doctors had repeatedly raised their suspicions about Lucy Letby with senior management. Reviews had found no concerns with her practice. But following the death of 2 triplet brothers in June 2016, Letby was taken off night shifts, and then off the unit completely and transferred into an admin role. There was an immediate reduction in deaths. But there could be another explanation.
A lot of people who remain convinced she was guilty, one of their killer arguments is that the deaths and the harm stopped when she left the unit. But it's also possible that the reason the deaths and the harms went down is because the unit was voluntarily downgraded, so it couldn't take babies that needed really intensive care. There would have been fewer babies on the unit. There would have been sufficient experts and staff on the unit to adequately manage the workload. So I think that's an equally plausible reason for why the deaths went down after Lucy Letby left.
Meanwhile, Lucy Letby took action against her removal.
On the 7th of September 2016, Lucy Letby lodged a grievance regarding her removal from duty as a nurse and her moving to a desk position. Lodging a grievance is a really serious thing to do. So to me, this speaks of somebody that just want moving back to their position because they see the removal as unfair.
The hospital upheld Letby's grievance, and the consultants were asked to apologise to her. But because of the association between Letby being on shift and serious incidents of deaths and collapses, doctors continued to suspect her. In May 2017, They went to the police. Lucy Letby never returned to nursing duties. A criminal investigation began, and a year later, Letby was arrested.
Hello, Lucy, is it? Yeah. Hello, my name.
Cheshire police footage of her arrest in 2018 was later released to the media.
Lucy Letby was arrested for the first time on the 3rd of July 2018. Just almost 2 years after she was moved to a desk job. Whether Lucy Letby is guilty or innocent, when a person is arrested and criminal allegations are brought, that is going to be frightening.
Did you have any concerns that there was a rise in the mortality rate? Yes. Okay, so tell me about that. What concerns did you have?
I think we don't just notice as a team in general, the nursing staff, that this was a rise compared to previous years.
Lucy Letby was arrested 3 times during a 3.5-year police investigation. Multiple searches took place at her home and work, leading to thousands of paper documents and digital forensics being seized. The police made a breakthrough discovery.
I don't deserve to live, she writes.
Police had discovered handwritten notes in her diary.
I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough to care for them. I'm a horrible, evil person.
They were widely reported in the press and presented in court as a confession.
It was quite a sensational piece of evidence. A series of different scribbles, like, I did this, I am evil, on its own, you think. Well, that's quite compelling. My name is Mark MacDonald. I've been a barrister for just over 26 years. I've been working on miscarriage of justice cases now for probably 15 to 20 years. She was being accused of being a murderer, and she was writing this down. That was put before the jury. The prosecution saying, here is an admission of wrongdoing made by her. What chance does she have?
The notes weren't written while she was nursing, but, Letby said, after she had been transferred away from the unit onto desk duties.
The notes also say things like, I didn't do anything wrong. My life is ruined, my life will never be the same.
Notes written by Lucy at different times after she was arrested, after the year-long or so investigation into her was taking place.
To me, these are external expressions of the mental anguish that she will have been suffering.
Ben Myers, KC, pointed out what was also on the note. She wrote that she would never have children or marry.
In one note, Letby had also written police discrimination. She said in one of 30 police interviews that writing was a way of getting her feelings out onto paper.
They're perfectly plausible as the output of somebody that is suffering extreme mental distress. I do not see the notes as a confession or as an admission of guilt.
In 2020, the police had everything they needed to take the case to trial. And in November, Letby was formally charged.
She's charged with the murders of 5 baby boys and 3 baby girls and the attempted murder of 10 babies.
Most people would agree that killing babies is the worst thing you could be accused of.
The diary notes may be open to question as a confession, but other evidence used to convict her at trial is even more controversial.
The proposed causes and mechanisms of her murdering these babies were just implausible. And that's a very polite way of putting it.
In October 2022, Lucy Letby's trial began.
Lucy Letby was working in the neonatal unit of the Countess of Chester Hospital at the time of the infant's deaths. Sky's Katerina Vitozzi has the latest for us from Manchester.
The prosecution believe Lucy Letby murdered 7 babies and tried to murder 10 others as a neonatal nurse working on that specialist ward.
The evidence appeared damning. She was accused of weaponizing her medical expertise to wreak multiple, unimaginable acts of murder.
The prosecution say what happened to these babies was persistent, calculated and cold-blooded.
The press was demanding answers. The parents were looking for justice. As the trial got underway, the jury heard about the spike in baby deaths on Letby's ward and saw the data showing she was the only nurse to have been on shift for all the deaths.
The jury were told these inexplicable deaths and sudden collapses did have an explanation, with prosecution claiming one nurse was present during every case. That nurse was Lucy Letby.
The trial moved on to examine the murders themselves, and the jury heard about each individual baby's case, one after the other.
They said she deliberately poisoned some babies with insulin. Others, they allege that she injected air directly into their bloodstream. Others, they say, she used too much milk.
One of the methods Lucy Letby was alleged to have used to attack babies was injecting air into their stomachs.
I am a consultant neonatologist. Even if we had a theory that a baby collapsed because somebody injected lots and lots and lots and lots of air into their tummy, which would be actually quite technically difficult to do, a competent team would have gone and aspirated out within the first couple of minutes of the resuscitation of the baby.
When I talk to neonatologists, they say that's just ridiculous. And the reasons it's ridiculous, the tubes are tiny, and to inject enough to cause some sort of catastrophic result, I think A, would take far too long, and B, almost certainly be absurd. But also, when you use a bag and mask over a baby's face, when you're resuscitating them, invariably air will go into the stomach.
Lucy Letby was also accused of injecting air into the baby's bloodstreams, causing an air embolism, an air bubble in a vein or artery, which would lead to collapse or death. During the investigation, the prosecution's lead medical expert saw in the baby's case notes that an unusual skin discoloration had been observed. He discovered in research that air embolisms can cause skin mottling. This expert, a retired consultant paediatrician, had specialized in treating children rather than premature babies.
I would argue that the people who should be qualified to be medical expert witnesses should be people currently practicing within that particular speciality or recently retired. Babies that are born prematurely function in a very different manner to older babies, children, and grown-ups. Our speciality is so different, and it is really hugely inappropriate for non-neonatologists to be giving evidence.
The paediatrician expert, whose findings were backed by a second expert witness, pointed to a research paper written in 1989 by one of Canada's top neonatologists.
They relied on a research paper that was very old by a chap called Dr. Shu, who'd written this and showed that certain skin changes can happen when there's air embolism. Well, he was called to the appeal. And at the appeal, he said, the skin changes that happened weren't the precise ones that I described.
Dr. Shu Li came forward after the original trial to tell the court that his theory had been inaccurately applied to the Letby case. One of the most compelling planks of the prosecution's argument was that Lucy Letby poisoned 2 babies with insulin. It's alleged that she added synthetic insulin to the babies' intravenous feed bags, causing them to suffer dangerously low blood sugar levels. a condition called hyperglycemia, which can be fatal. Several experts have since challenged the accuracy of the insulin test presented at court.
My name is Alan Wayne Jones. I'm now retired, but I used to be a professor in forensic toxicology. One of the poisons I'm interested in is insulin. I read that 2 of the babies had allegedly been given insulin. And that twigged my interest because I'd written articles about insulin poisoning. So I was pretty knowledgeable about its use as a weapon, if you like. I took a closer look at the evidence in that case, and I didn't like what I found. I read that the analysis of insulin was done by an immunoassay method, and I don't think that is sufficient for use in a criminal prosecution. You need more robust methods of analysis to charge someone with administering insulin with malicious intent. But people shouldn't accept that kind of flimsy analytical result. You really need to verify by more robust methods the result for use in a criminal prosecution.
A more robust test wasn't performed, and both babies made a full recovery.
The proposed causes and mechanisms of her murdering these babies were just implausible. And that's a very polite way of putting it.
Nearly all but one was premature. Most were less than 3 pounds. One was less than 2 pounds, I think, and described by one of the nurses as one of the tiniest babies I've ever seen. Now, that doesn't mean Lucy Letby didn't harm them. It does mean as they were probably at high risk of death.
No one saw Letby harming any of the babies. The case is almost entirely circumstantial.
With Lucy Letby, they're alleging she used a whole load of bizarre methods, but the most damning thing to me is if you were going to use all these methods, you would have researched them. But she didn't research any of these methods. How would you expect a neonatal nurse to come up with this without leaving any evidence of researching it on the internet?
I have no idea whether Lucy Letby was innocent. But if there is evidence of guilt, then it's not been presented to the courts as far as I'm concerned.
Another question now being asked is, did these alleged methods of murder align with the original causes of death?
6 of the 7 babies that Lucy Letby is convicted of murdering had had post-mortems at the regional specialist centre at Alderhay Hospital by experienced perinatal or paediatric pathologists. And in all of those cases, or 5 of those cases, they found natural causes, and in one case they couldn't determine a cause of death, but they did not say it was unnatural. None of them had picked up any foul play. I don't understand how the pathologists at the time could have reached these conclusions, and then they were turned on their head and changed completely during the trial.
With such specific methods of murder presented as evidence in court, the question remains why the original post-mortems didn't pick any of them up. The jury found it hard to reach a unanimous verdict in all the individual cases. So in some, the judge told them he'd accept a majority decision. In August 2023, the verdict was finally given.
This was a cruel, calculated and cynical campaign of child murder.
Lucy Letby was in court to hear the first 2 deliveries of those guilty verdicts. She did cry, her parents cried, they were heard whispering to each other, "You can't be serious, this can't be right," and then breaking down in tears.
Lucy Letby was given 14 whole life sentences and a final 15th in July 2024. making her only the 4th woman in the UK condemned to die in prison. But how fair was her trial? And why did no medical experts take the stand for the defence?
There are not doctors who are willing to stand up and defend cases challenging the mainstream view because they're frightened of being hounded out of their careers for it.
Since Lucy Letby's conviction, questions have continued to be asked about the fairness of her trial.
All I can say is on the basis of the experts who've contacted me and the knowledge of the trial I've been able to have, there are lots of things that don't sit well with me and don't make it look like her guilt was proved beyond reasonable doubt.
During the 10-month trial, 6 medical experts were called for the prosecution, but none were called for the defence.
One of the key problems for me is that defence had a very credible expert, Mike Hall, a retired neonatologist, who prepared detailed reports on all the baby deaths and the near misses. But because he wasn't called to the trial to give evidence in person, his written reports were never seen by the jury. You can choose not to use someone, but actually not to let the jury read the expert report seems very unfair.
Well, what you have when you don't have defence experts is prosecution experts going pretty much unchallenged. So you're left there with this expert's evidence hanging, with no other experts saying, well, actually, that can't be right. It leaves almost certainly to the inevitable consequence that someone's going to be convicted. Does it surprise me that in the Lucy Letby trial, no medical experts were called for the defence? No, it doesn't. But I know, having been involved in numerous child abuse cases, how difficult it is to get an expert in this country to help you. They won't.
The general reluctance of medical experts to come forward might be traced back to the brutal example made of one particular specialist doctor.
I'm Dr. Wayne Squire, and I'm a retired paediatric neuropathologist, which means that for my 40-year career, I examined the brains of babies who have died. My career story has become a cautionary tale, warning doctors that if they stand up and act as defence experts, it could destroy your career.
Preeminent in her field, Dr. Squire was often called to give evidence in court on cases of shaken baby syndrome.
Linda, that's not her real name, but her baby collapsed suddenly one night, and within moments, certainly within hours of him being admitted to hospital, he was found to have some bleeding around his brain and behind his eyes, and the doctors had made a diagnosis of shaken baby syndrome.
The mother was convicted and sent to prison. At her appeal, Dr. Squire gave evidence for the defence.
I started looking at the literature and realised, because of some research I'd read that was current at the time, that this was probably not correct. And there's never been any scientific evidence that actually shows that it's a real condition.
Her evidence helped to get Linda's conviction overturned, but the cost to Dr. Squire was immense.
Once I had given evidence in the appeal, things changed dramatically around me. It didn't go down well. It didn't go down well in the courts. I was forced to go through a hearing. It was a pretty traumatizing time. It totally interfered with my work life, and of course it had a huge effect on my personal life and well-being as well. It was just a relentless 6 months of being told how awful I was, how wrong I was, and yet knowing inside that I'd only been true to the science. When I was being criticised in the courts, and many of my colleagues said, why do you do this? And the answer is that I believe in science. I believed in the evidence that I had read, and I strongly believed that my opinion was backed by good science. And what we were seeing in courts is people being found guilty, people going to prison, people having their babies taken away on the evidence of a hypothesis. I have read about the Lucy Letby case. One of the things that has concerned me is that there are no medical experts for the defence. I think that the fact that there were no defence experts simply reflects what's been going on in this country. And it's worse in this country, I think, than in many cases, in many places around the world, that there are not doctors who are willing to stand up and defend cases where there are babies, where they may be challenging a lot of other people or a mainstream view, because they're frightened of being hounded out of court or hounded out of their careers for it.
In May 2024, Lucy Letby was denied permission to appeal against her conviction.
Understandably, people feel that our criminal justice system works. And if something has gone wrong, then the Court of Appeal will step in and overturn those convictions. Sadly, it does not work that way. Remember that the Birmingham Six were rejected by the Court of Appeal 2, maybe 3 times before that conviction was overturned. The Court of Appeal don't always get it right. In fact, they often get it wrong.
The questions around Lucy Letby's convictions are growing, and doubts about the evidence used to convict her continue to make headlines in the British press.
Lucy Letby has lit something within the medical and nursing profession. And there are doctors and there are nurses that have realised there is something really concerning about this conviction.
Lucy was an extremely qualified nurse and colleagues trusted her. It doesn't seem to me that Lucy Letby being a murderer is the only explanation for all of these things happening.
The most depressing thing for me, because she's lost at appeal, for it to be reviewed, it could take another 5 years or so. And for me, that's profoundly depressing, because justice could clearly be better served if all the evidence that is now coming out was heard in court the first time around.
When there are significant system flaws, they lead to poor patient outcomes. The easiest thing to do is to scapegoat an individual.
If this conviction is unsafe, I think it would be probably the biggest miscarriage of justice in the United Kingdom.
And if you or someone you know has been affected by what you've seen in tonight's programme, find organisations offering support at channel5.com/helplines. New this week, a tragic scene in an elderly couple's home, but what was the cause of death? The coroner investigates Wednesday at 9. Next, Police 999, Hour of Duty. Stay with us.